is John Monarch. I've played a variety of roles in this industry, actually ranging from affiliate manager to media buyer to affiliate to advertiser to banking and credit consultant, actually. And that's why I felt like giving this talk, because it always seemed to me that the most misunderstood, or no one really completely understood what goes on in the back end of the credit card processing side of things. Specifically, we have so many merchants out there that they just get a merchant account and they feel like they're safe, or many people process through PayPal. But here's the big question. How many of you have personally or know someone who has had a PayPal account frozen or shut down? I mean, it's fairly common. I'd say at least 10 to 20, 30% of people that we might know have had this frozen, cut off. And you know, when they freeze your funds, it's typically for an 8 to 12 month period at a time as well, where they wait on chargebacks. So a lot of people need to get the basic concept of how to move beyond PayPal, Google Checkout, and things of that nature. So we'll start with what's the basic setup that you actually need beyond PayPal? Well, a merchant account or merchant ID. You go through banks, you go through IPSPs and ISOs. We'll get to that in a couple minutes here. But that's the actual account that allows you to process the card. So it's the account where the user's credit card funds are deposited directly to the account. A gateway, such as Authorize.net or NMI, well, the gateway is the actual terminal, basically, in which the credit cards are processed online, comparable to where you go up to the store and you swipe your card and it runs through. Well, that's the basic equivalent of this. You'll need a CRM. Many shopping carts for e-commerce basics actually include a CRM that does this type of stuff. If you plan on doing subscription services, you'll need to be PCI compliant, because then you have to store the credit card information of your customers, and that's a whole different can of worms that you have to open up security-wise. And approvals, declines, errors, etc. Why was my card declined? What does this error mean? Why is my decline rate all of a sudden 40%? So we'll get started. I already described what a merchant account is, but who has merchant accounts? It's like I said, there's banks. You can go direct to a local bank even. Many of them have merchant accounts they can provide you. National banks such as Bank of America, Wells Fargo, etc., as well as these mysterious ISO/MSPs and IPSPs. Well, an ISO is an independent sales organization as labeled by Visa, same as MSP, Master Service Provider, for MasterCard. Basically what those are is they're third-party sales programs that will connect you with typically a larger bank out there that will offer you the merchant account. Whereas the ISO and the MSP they underwrite none of the risk on the account. Whereas an IPSP, on the other hand, the IPSP is actually a different label by Visa, in which the organization actually underwrites the risk involved in processing your credit. Typically this is good and bad. Many times with IPSPs you can find lower rates, strangely enough, because ISOs have typically a higher markup, which is kind of odd despite them not taking on any of the risk. Going direct to the bank is preferable in many ways, but it's not always an option for many people, just because banks are much more decline happy. So you won't get as easy of an approval on your new merchant account going directly through the bank, depending on your program, of course. So that's why ISOs and MSPs and IPSPs are often the better choice. So if you're running something that's a subscription service, continuity, or falls under a high risk category, even such as travel. Travel actually falls under high risk many times due to the chargeback risk. Then you'll want to go through an IPSP, because typically the banks will not authorize those anymore, at least. So what about PayPal? Well, we already know a few people that have had horrible experiences with PayPal. It's one of those that it provides a nice service for customers and all that, and it's very easy for people to charge back on PayPal, but it's a nightmare for anyone who's actually accepting the payments. I personally never work with PayPal, and this isn't a knock if you do, but it's really, I don't recommend it at all. You have high odds of having funds frozen, whether you're doing eBay sales, whether you're doing e-commerce, etc. And on top of that, PayPal actually adds extra steps to checkout, which can lower your conversion rate, because many times people have to log in. Many people have the PayPal security code that has to be texted to their phone. So by that time, you've gone through at least 4 or 5 additional pages to your checkout that kills your conversion rate. So despite PayPal claiming that it can often increase the conversion rate, it's not always the case. It's very independent of what your product is, who's buying, who your typical buyer, etc. How about ClickBank if you're offering digital products, Plimus, or Google Checkout? Well, ClickBank and Plimus are actually very similar to each other. And they're very targeted towards the digital product, of course. I mean, there are people that do standard products. But again, the thing about them is the markup on the account as well as the payment terms. Typically, the payment terms on a normal merchant account end up being, for domestic, you'll get your money deposited to your account within a day or two. With offshore, typically 2 to 3 weeks, whereas ClickBank, Plimus, etc., it often takes a month. So it depends on your cash flow and how much you're floating on your product. So what about gateways? Why do you need a gateway? Like I said, it's the equivalent of a point of sale. NMI, authorized.net, and this is a point of confusion that many people actually have. People go to authorized.net and they think that they're signing up for a merchant account here when they're not. You're just getting gateway access. You're getting an API to connect your CRM or your shopping cart through. But Authorized is not a payment provider. They're not a processor themselves. Gateway often can impact your business in several ways, though, because I've dealt with gateways such as Authorized and NMI, which are very refined, they've gone through the steps to actually make their gateway a top quality product. Whereas I've had some offshore processors that use custom gateways. And there are ups and downs to that. One of the downsides being that they haven't gone through the refinement process. So for instance, one of my products actually, when people enter their credit card information, if they put a space in, it doesn't know how to handle a space. So it throws back an error or a decline. So oftentimes that raises people's decline rates and they don't even understand why. And if you ask the service provider, many times they won't know. So it's one of those things that you really have to decide what's best for you gateway-wise, especially if you're the one implementing it into your software, your shopping cart or your CRM. So CRM versus cart, it's direct response versus e-commerce, basically. If you're running a typical e-commerce, store, you'll want your shopping cart software often has the capabilities of handling basic CRM needs built in. Whereas if you're doing direct response, such as continuity products, anything that's even if it's a straight sale direct response, then you need a separate CRM to handle this. It's not your typical cart, whereas most people would use something like Magento, etc. So what would you use? It's like Limelight CRM, for example. I've not personally worked with them, but I know that they're a good provider of one. There's also Orange CRM for direct response. Whereas for e-commerce, there's Magento, OS Commerce, etc. So yes, this actually can impact your conversion rate too, depending on how well refined your cart backend is. The processing times on your server even too. Whereas the CRMs, many of them are hosted separately from your servers. So it actually relies on their hosting to make sure that your conversion rate actually stays up. So many of the gateway errors, like I said, you'd have spaces in your credit card number, security violations, an invalid loan checksum, which is the final digit of a credit card number is actually a checksum. It doesn't really mean anything for the account itself, but all that does is it verifies that mathematically this is a valid credit card number. Data handling errors, your CRM can have errors. Many times if the server, if they're doing upgrades, you would hope that service providers that do a CRM, software as a service, you would hope that they would have this worked out. But I've run into errors before where they're updating PHP or they're updating MySQL and it comes out and it tosses back a bunch of declines at me, for the next hour. So you have to verify that your provider is actually going to do that, or if you're hosting it yourself, that you don't start upgrading on live servers and it'll kill your conversion rate. Not all declines are equal too. Your gateway typically will have its own definitions, but many of them follow the standard Visa and MasterCard decline reasons. Offshore ones typically actually have different codes, but they mean the same things. Some declines can actually be good because many of the gateways or merchant accounts will often block certain BINs. Well, what's a BIN? A BIN is the first 6 digits of your credit card number that often, it's the bank identification number. So that specifically tells me what bank, what level card, If it, Visa, American Express, whatever, platinum, debit, credit, prepay. NSF, not sufficient funds. While this is mostly bad for e-commerce people, this is not always bad if you're doing a subscription service. If someone comes back, for instance, we know a lot of people in the free trial space or in the travel space that have or subscription magazines even, something like that. Well, if they come back in NSF on your first transaction, that can actually be a good thing. Because if you're, for instance, doing a trial service like Netflix or any of the continuity products that we know of, you're doing a free trial, only pay $2.95 for the first one. Well, 2 weeks later, when you're ready to bill them, it's going to process as not sufficient funds, even though they paid the $2.95, and you've probably already paid your affiliates for the traffic. Now it's going to come back 2 weeks later and decline. So you just lost a bunch of money basically because they didn't have enough money in their account, or they're overdrawn, or their credit card is at the max. So not sufficient funds is not always a bad thing. Sometimes I'm pretty happy when I see that. Fraud prevention, you always want to make sure that you've got good fraud prevention in place, and this is why declines that can be security violations or fraud related, I'm very happy to see as well. So a BIN is, as I said, a bank identification number. Certain BINs you really do want to block, and this will definitely impact your conversion rate regardless of what you're running. So it can be continuity, it could be straight sale, it could be e-commerce for a pet store or something like that. So what do the BINs actually mean, and how do we know what BINs to block? Sample, I really don't like prepaid cards, for instance, especially like I said, if you're running a continuity, a subscription, etc., then I personally block green dot. So 511122 is a green dot MasterCard, or 489212 is a green dot Visa. I block carte blanche all Visa, not specifically carte blanche, but all prepaid green dot, was it Rush Card, etc. So what does the first number of the BIN mean? This is actually what industry identification code it is. So 0 is an ISO TC68 reserved for the future assignment. It doesn't actually mean anything right now. 1 is airline cards, specifically. So if American Airlines, Delta, AirTran, they all had their own credit cards that were not Visa or MasterCard related, and many of them still do. That would be 1. 2 is also the same, as well as future assignments. 3 is travel and entertainment and banking and financial. American Express is 3. JCB, which is Japan, their most popular card over there. 4, banking and financial, that's Visa. All of 4 is going to be Visa, period. 5, MasterCard. Diners Club, but Maestro debit, but it's typically MasterCard. 6, merchandising, banking, and financial, so that's your Discover, as well as China Union Pay, which many people are going to start having to accept. Funny enough, Walmart actually now accepts Union Pay. It is the single most popular card in China simply because it was actually endorsed by their government. It was backed by their government, etc. 7, petroleum companies, so ExxonMobil, etc., has their own cards, not non-Visa. Fuelman, fleet cards, Sunoco. 8 is healthcare and telecom. And 9 is national assignment and government. So here's a few examples. American Express Platinum, as well as Centurion 3715, and so on. HSBC Hong Kong, Swedbank temporary ATM 30-day card for 9. That's the Swedish government. So if anyone wants to actually give the first 6 of any kind of card number they have, I can get their BIN right now and tell them what the bank is, what level it is, if anyone's willing to volunteer the first 6. All right, let's go through the BIN database that I have access to here. Many companies actually maintain BIN databases. It's technically supposed to be public info, but many companies actually provide them as a service they update them constantly, or if there's been a bank buyout or collapse, then they need to update it. And many times BINs are being bought, daily by new banks or new, etc. So this is a Guarantee Bank American Express credit from Turkey. Exactly.
How do we get access to the database?
That's what I'll get to in 1 second here, actually. There are multiple providers, such as at the bottom of my list, BinBase and BinDB. So you can go to binbase.com or bindb.com. These are completely separate companies, but actually provide, for instance, BinBase offers a 1-year subscription. I don't recall exactly what it is. I want to say it's like $700, and it's constantly updated for that year. And you get to keep the database after your subscription expires. It's just no longer updated. I believe BinDB has the same thing. And it's very useful to have because in your CRM, in your shopping cart, whatever you have, you can go through and specifically block the bins that you don't want. I mean, it's one of the greatest things too. And it's actually really good for fraud control as well. So you can have, like I said, automatic bin rejection, verification for fraud. And not only that, but automatic MII selection on the checkout page, so if someone puts in a 3, it'll automatically say American Express, and I've got some examples of that later on. Or 4, it'll automatically list as Visa. 5, MasterCard, or typically you go by the first 2 just because 5 also has Diners Club. But it can increase your conversion rate. We had in our experience by 30% by not actually having the user select which credit card they have. Just type it in and go, and it automatically recognizes it. Having a field for credit card is kind of a waste of time as long as you have access to a database. Anytime you can cut down on an additional field, I'd do it. So here's an example. This is actually PayPal, which they're not stupid, honestly. It's just I don't like working with them due to the risks. So when you type in 3715, it highlights American Express, or 4012 Visa, 53044 MasterCard, 6200 Discover. Personally, if you're accepting American Express, that's one of those that you'll have to watch for chargebacks. Visa and MasterCard, since the chargebacks actually go through independent banks, it's a little bit different of a situation. Whereas American Express, all chargebacks are handled by American Express typically, unless it's licensed through, like there's a Bank of America American Express. But American Express actually has a hand in keeping their brand name, held up to a standard. So what they do is they typically approve all chargebacks no matter what people say. So it'll count against you. It's all a personal choice if you want to accept American Express, if you feel it's a necessary thing. Most e-commerce providers will want American Express, so you really don't have to worry about chargebacks too much. As for subscription services, that's a different story though. Here's a few of my references. This is actually a fairly short talk. And if you need any of the sites, you can feel free to email me. My email address is m@monarchllc.net. And I think we'll get started on question and answer. Not sure how we get to that. Do we have the mic ready for question and answer? Where's that? Oh. So if they got anything to say, they can just go to the mic. Yeah. So if you have any questions about the talk or anything related to credit cards, just please go ahead. Seriously, I'd love to answer your questions.
So, we had that dreaded problem with PayPal, held crazy amount of money of ours. Finally, though, we got them to say that they would extend it out and keep billing for another 30 days, and then they said they'd release the funds, over 90 days instead of, which it's happened in 2 of our accounts now, so it seems maybe that's starting to be one of their new things where they're going to start releasing funds earlier. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so we're trying to switch to some merchant accounts. We're having a lot of trouble with that. One of the problems, we are a subscription-based model. We've had a problem where we're having a lot of high decline rates. One of the banks said that that's a problem. I don't really, we've set it to where it's pretty much accept anything, not decline it for address or anything like that. But do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, your declines can actually be based on several factors. One of them being the actual credit card that the user is using, but typically that doesn't become the problem until it's something that's extremely high risk. It could be what you have your merchant code identified as. Many times people, e-commerce, they don't have it labeled right, or if you're high risk, then you have an asterisk in your your billing statement, what it's supposed to be. And if it's above, what, 15%, I'd say, is that?
Yeah, I mean, our decline rate's like 30%.
Oh, good Lord, okay. That might be a gateway issue then even. There's just so many variables when it comes to the decline rate that it could be the bank itself, it could be the gateway.
So like we're using like Authorize.
Right.
Using, starts with E,
Mm-hmm.
something like that. And I mean, I don't know that the decline rate is that high through them, but that's what Authorize.net says. Visa, 60 to 70% approval rate.
Yeah, that specifically, I mean, it could be a way that you have the gateway coded, depending on the software that you're using, the API integration there. For instance, like I said, the spacing issue, if your API, if the way you integrate it doesn't handle spaces correctly, you might want to go through and do a regular expression to handle all credit cards with spaces input. That actually led to it with ours once. So we had our programmer go in and write a regular expression that went through and concatenated all spaces. That can help. And it really depends on the identifier that you chose. So it could be the specific identifier that your merchant program has that is leading to a higher decline rate. It's one of those that you'll really have to dig in specifically and find where the blockage is, and work from it from there.
So I mean, having a decline rate that high will get us kicked from that merchant, right?
It can. It really depends on the bank specifically, because we've had a decline rate. For instance, if you're down in Brazil and you're trying to use a merchant account that's not from Brazil, anywhere outside of there, your decline rate's probably going to hit 50 to 60%. And you won't get kicked off the mid, but you will, you're losing a lot of money at that point by having over half of card transactions declined. So it may not get you kicked off. It just all depends on the bank's terms that you have or the IPSP that you're working with.
Yeah, it actually seems like a lot of them is like, the same person was trying like 10 times. So then we limit it to where they can only try 3 times.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just so high.
Yeah, we have that too. We get people that are, they attempt like 6, 7, 8 times, and it's just like they hit submit over and over and over and over again. It's like they have nothing else to do but to click submit, which I'm glad they want to buy my stuff, but at the same time, it's like you're screwing up my decline rate, man. So it could be that, and I don't know if limiting the attempts is a good idea or not. Like I said, it really just depends on the specific, mid that you have. Yes.
You didn't touch on it, but I wondered, what's your familiarity with the dunning process and best practices with the dunning process? Because I have a subscription-based service too, use Authorize.net. That 30% is not uncommon at all. That's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of that's the dunning process too.
Right.
If you're going back and trying to get those cards out of it, let the customer know that their card's expired or their.
This is on initial sales, not on recurring portion.
Okay. But can you talk a little bit about that dunning process?
I'd really have to get more info on that, honestly, just because specifically we have people that handle all that type of stuff with my group. But I mean, if you're talking about a subscription-based model, then you will want, like he had suggested, or to put back the decline code depending on what gateway you're using. I mean, like I said, typically the U.S. ones actually have the same decline code, so issuing it back and sending it as an alert. So, if they get not sufficient funds, you toss that back, or just card expired, I would toss that back. I apologize, I can't speak more on that specific subject, though. It is.
So do you have any advice about if someone's starting a subscription service? Like if you were to start one, how would you go about setting up the payment processing and the recurring billing?
It really depends on what your subscription service is. I always typically like to go through domestic merchant accounts if at all possible. There's a few cases where offshore is the only option nowadays. For instance, if you have an electronic cigarette, those are now whether you're doing regular sales or subscription, et cetera, most banks are just denying those across the board. So to get started on that, I mean, first off, you have to know the differences in what your expected chargebacks are going to be, what your anticipated refunds, et cetera, are going to be, because with domestic accounts, one of the little secrets that most people don't realize is that with a domestic merchant account, your chargebacks are a maximum of 1%, whereas with offshore, you're talking 2%. And the third one is if you're processing under $50,000 a month, then you're under a separate rule altogether, where you get a grand total of 100 chargebacks for Visa, 50 for MasterCard, and that's it, where it's not by percentage. I would personally start with that by talking to an ISO or an IPSP. I typically don't like to go straight to the bank. That's usually down the line. There are many ISOs and IPSPs. I can tell you some afterwards. I don't really like to stump for people during a talk. I mean, despite talking about bin base, et cetera. But I would talk to one of them, and I would get set up with. Many of them have preferred gateways, and I would get linked up with them, and they can help you with quite a bit. And I would do. Let's see, like I said, domestic, authorizer, NMI, have a good CRM in place. I don't know if you've got a custom coded one or if you're going to use a software as a service. And from there, it's actually pretty simple. I would not even consider PayPal, Google Checkout, and any of the others for a subscription nowadays.
So how about maybe like the concept of padding? I don't know if it's legal or whatever, but can you pad your charges as far as to try to keep your chargebacks low? Do they base it on dollar amount, the percentage,
Yeah.
or it's dollar amount? So
It
you
is.
couldn't just do $100 charges to keep your...
Yeah, but that's actually under the not allowed by the rules. I mean, that's actually one of those things that's covered. You know, padding chargebacks is not allowed. A lot of people had attempted to move things between, like splitting the transaction between two separate merchant accounts. That's not allowed either. That's a good way to get yourself stuck on the match list. And for those of you who don't know, match or TMF, terminated merchant file, is basically like the elephant graveyard for e-commerce. You really don't want to be put on that list. First off, it means that you, in your name, personally, will never be able to get credit card processing ever again, period. Beyond that, it also actually stays on your credit history that it shows up that you've been put on match. It doesn't impact your credit score or anything, but it does show up on your history that you were on the match list. That's for breaking the rules, though. That's if you're padding for avoiding chargebacks, if you're factoring, if you are under an incorrect merchant identifier code. For instance, one of the things that Visa and MasterCard have been cracking down on quite a bit recently is a retail one, and it's where gentlemen's clubs, strip clubs, have been identifying themselves as restaurants, and that's not correct, of course. And shows up on your statement as a restaurant, and no. Well, you can get in serious trouble for that, and many have been fined $200,000 by Visa and MasterCard for doing things like that. Another one, like I said, factoring, you can't do that. You can't cross-sell. Cross-selling is specifically against the agreement. So that basically cross-selling is when after purchase, in your hidden deep in your terms and conditions somewhere, you've basically said, well, you agree to allow our partners to charge you for this service as well. It's a separate company, it's a separate identifier, it's a separate transaction, separate everything. So without them approving the transaction, you basically said, okay, well, we're going to sell your credit card info off to our buddies over here and sign you up for, this. It's like, well, you bought our diet product, so how about we sign you up for Health Tracker and you don't even know about it. So that goes through several companies, and the reason that got popular and got cracked down on subsequently was because people were actually trying to do that to reduce chargebacks. They were padding transactions by doing that. So it was like, all right, well, we'll take a loss on this one, but we're going to send the rest of the transaction over here and provide another service. But really, it's just to pad it and avoid chargebacks, and it's cross-selling. It's not allowed.
Any thought on, is it even worth fighting chargebacks and subscriptions?
Yes, it is. It most definitely is.
How do you go about doing that? Because I haven't had success.
You have to actually just approach the bank specifically, whatever bank was charged back through. Typically what happens is with our merchant accounts, our merchant bank provides us a list of customers and IDs, transaction IDs that were charged back. We contact the customer first and we attempt to contact their bank. Unfortunately, what really sucks in my opinion is that regardless of if you win or lose a chargeback, it still counts against you. So it counts against your ratio for the month, and there's nothing you can do about that. But what you can do is you can avoid paying the chargeback fee if you win. You can avoid, giving a refund if you win. which can be very beneficial. You don't lose as much money, but it still counts against you, unfortunately.
Have you heard anything about Visa maybe upping their percentage for subscription-based models, or
No.
they just don't care?
Not for domestic, because what's really odd in that world is that despite everything being under the Visa flag, Visa US, Visa International, and Visa Europe actually operate completely independently, and they all kind of hate each other for some reason. So Visa US typically leads with new regulations and new types of stuff like that. So if Visa US says, well, we're going to actually reduce chargeback rate to 0.8%. And we're going to implement this as high risk, and you're not allowed to run these identifiers anymore, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's been a lot of issues with, now that Visa US has a bunch of new regulations in place, Visa International has followed along. Well, that means Caribbean banks, many times South America, et cetera. They're second to follow. Well, Visa Europe is usually last. I really can't even explain why that is, but it just kind of is. So there's really no shot in subscription services raising the 1% rule in the U.S. The only way around that would be to go international, Europe, et cetera, and you get 2% with that.
So I noticed you've been bashing PayPal a lot, and we've actually been using PayPal for a while and we've been fairly happy with it, but we haven't been frozen or anything like that. But we're thinking of starting a subscription service, and why wouldn't you use PayPal as a subscription service? And maybe you can just talk more about why you're kind of guiding people away from PayPal in general.
Right, because the actual process that they have for disputes, I really don't like myself. And many of my friends, it doesn't come from a personal experience. I've never actually had one of my accounts frozen, but I usually use it for small things. But many friends, colleagues, et cetera, have had PayPal accounts frozen with well over $200,000 in it. And it's really the dispute process on that as well. Basically, we're going to hold your money for a year. Even if you try to negotiate, the most we'll lower it to is 8 months. Sometimes they slap people with a reserve that's, if I go to a merchant account, specifically in a continuity space, I know I'm probably going to have a rolling reserve, whether it be 5 or 10%. I just kind of put that up front. But with PayPal on subscription services, they don't tell you that. And sometimes, a month and a half or 2 months in, you'll get slapped with a 20% reserve, 8 months. So that really puts a hit on your cash flow, and there's not a whole lot you can do about it, because now all of a sudden, if you're running $100,000 in sales a month, all of a sudden $20,000 of your sales is going in PayPal for a year. I think that's absurd that they can do that just after they've already agreed to provide you the service. They just suddenly go back and say, oh, wait a second, we don't like what you're doing, or it even looks a slight bit suspicious to us. So we're going to slap a reserve on you, and if it continues to look even more suspicious, we're just going to freeze you. So that's my personal opinions on PayPal. Many people have subscription services with them and are quite happy, but being around so many people that have had accounts frozen and money taken, etc., it's just been a choice I've chosen to stay away from PayPal as much as I can. Exactly. It's one of those things that everyone's like, well, it hasn't happened to me. I guess I'll stick with PayPal. And then all of a sudden, boom.
And they don't tell you why. They don't tell you being up to it. So it's like all of a sudden it's a problem. They hit you with a reserve. They don't tell you why. They tell you some other stuff that's not even what it's about. Several times. So be very careful.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
It's not only the initial pay you take, but you lose 5 or 6 months of subscription, million, half a million, how much ever month it is. It's huge.
Your data gets completely lost unless you have a way of, PCI compliant storing it in your CRM. And many times PayPal doesn't like that. They want you to, you go through their checkout system, so you can't actually store any kind of the credit card information. It's just one of those things that for subscription services, I really, really tell people to stay away from PayPal. If you're selling just a straight up product or you're soliciting donations for your site, then yeah, PayPal, that's not a problem. Even the donation space has had some trouble. I know a website that It was right after Hurricane Katrina. They put up a PayPal account for donations, and they raised $25,000 in a day. Well, PayPal froze that on suspicious activity, saying that there's absolutely no way that they could raise that much in a single day, despite the site having around 100,000 regular users. Well, they froze it. None of the money ended up going to charity. 6 months later, they had to refund everyone who donated. It was a complete mess. It's just not. I've never, of all the horror stories I've heard about PayPal, it's just not worth it to me. Do you have anything else? Or? All right, well, thank you very much, everyone. If you have any questions afterwards, just feel free to talk to me. I'll give you my email address, phone number, whatever you need.